Alright, howdy y'all, my name is Kevin Knapik. I'm the 4-H and Youth Development County Extension Agent here in Bexar County in Texas. And today I'm going to be giving y'all a lesson on the life cycle. Our main topic is going to be reptiles and amphibians, but I also wanted to cover some mammals and some birds to give y'all a background of what all of these different life cycles look like. So let's dive right into it. So first, what is a life cycle? So y'all have already had some lessons looking at plants and insects. So can y'all think about what might be the definition of a life cycle? So I want y'all to pause the video for a sec and think about the definition. And then when you think you got it, go ahead and resume the video and we'll look and see if y'all were right. So the definition of a life cycle is a series of stages a living thing goes through during its life. So this is going from a baby to an adult, and they can look very different depending on the animals. So we have a lot of different types of life cycles. So here on the right, y'all see life cycles for plants, butterflies, frogs, and chickens. So how many types of life cycles do y'all think there are? So make a quick mental guess in your mind, and let's see if you can get it right. So there are actually 6 different types of life cycles out there. So we have plants, we have insects, we have mammals, we have birds, we have reptiles, and we have amphibians. You may be wondering in your mind, what is an amphibian? What is Kevin talking about? So amphibian would be the category that frogs fall into. So we're looking at the frogs in amphibians. Reptiles would be your lizards, of course your birds. Mammals would be us, your dog, your cat, bobcats, cougars, coyotes. We're going to look at mammals here in just a minute. Insects and plants y'all have already looked at, so y'all should be kind of familiar with their life cycles, but to look at them a little bit closer. So we have a plant life cycle here going from a seed to a cotyledon to a seedling to an adult plant, which then flowers to help plants reproduce. Then we have our insects. So we have butterflies that go from eggs to caterpillar to a chrysalis to an adult. Then we have our frogs. So this is mainly what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the frogs. Frogs have 4 main parts to their life cycle. So they go from eggs to tadpoles to froglets and finally to an adult. And then last but not least, for an example of a bird life cycle here, we have a chicken. So I want y'all to see if you can figure out how many of y'all, any of y'all ever incubated a chicken egg and actually watched the chicken egg hatch and watched them grow up? This is the process that they'll go through. So they go from an egg to a hatchling to a chick and then finally to an adult. So those are an overview of the different life cycles. So let's zoom in real close and look at the different life cycles. So let's start with the mammals. So mammal life cycles. So all life cycles are going to follow a very similar pattern. That's going to start with birth, then to growth, then reproduction, which will then circle around back to birth. And for the adults, it will unfortunately mean death. And we'll talk about why death is so important to the life cycles a little bit on the tail end of this lesson and leading into our next lesson. So for mammals, so we have 3 main stages of a mammal life cycle. So we have birth, we have the adolescent stage, which is kind of, for us, we refer to as the kid stage. And then we have adulthood. So we're going to use, in our example today, we're going to use a dog as our example of a mammal life cycle. So we'll start at the top, and if you imagine it like a clock at 12 o'clock. So we have a mother with her babies. So we have birth. So mammals actually give live birth. So in other words, the animals that are born are just appearing as a smaller version of the adults. So they can actually, after a very short period, they can defend themselves, they can move, they can look for food. So they have the means to survive, maybe not completely on their own, but they can actually survive. So then we move over to, in our dog example, which would be moving from puppy over to adolescence. So the mammals will actually just continue to grow in size. So as we grow up, our hands get bigger, our ears get bigger, our feet get bigger. How many of y'all have had your parents had to buy y'all a couple of different sizes of shoes, right? Yeah, that's one of the things going back to school, getting back in the groove of things. You had to get bigger clothes because you've grown bigger. So mammals will continue to increase in their size till they reach adulthood. The important portion of adulthood is reproduction. We have to have more animals because if we lose the ability for animals to be born, we're going to lose the total population of animals. So you're saying, Kevin, what does that mean? That means, have y'all ever heard of the phrase an animal has gone extinct? It means there's no more living in the wild. So that's why it's so important that we have birth, but death, even though it's a sad part of life, is also important to the life cycle because, as we'll talk about in our next lesson, the earth can only support and have so many animals on it at a time. Otherwise, we start to see bad things start happening. And we're going to go into examples of what that looks like in our next lesson. So let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here. So that is our mammal life cycle. Our next one we're going to look at is our birds. So the bird life cycle is a little bit different than the mammals. So we're going to use a chicken in our example here again. So chickens are actually born from eggs. So chickens and other birds do not have a live birth. Live birth is one of the hallmark traits of mammals, even though there are 2 mammals that actually lay eggs. But in our birds, they lay eggs, they hatch from eggs, and then those hatchlings will develop into fully developed adults and will reproduce to carry on the chicken population in the world. And that's also where we get eggs. How many of y'all like eggs for breakfast? How many of y'all like scrambled eggs? That's one of my favorite breakfast foods. All right, I'm getting off topic a little bit. I apologize. So in our chickens, so they're adolescents or the chick stage. So chicks, when they're born, if y'all have ever seen a chicken when they hatch, their feathers are real fluffy. They're going to be usually yellow in color. They don't necessarily look like the adults, right? A baby chick doesn't look like a hen or a rooster. So what happens? How does that happen? So as chickens develop, they will actually lose or molt, as we say, M-O-L-T. So when chickens molt, they'll actually begin to develop their adult feathers. Kind of like how as we grow older, we lose a set of teeth, right? And we get our adult teeth in our mouth. It's similar for chickens when they get their feathers. So once they reach adulthood, again, reproduction is the primary goal. We have to have more chickens in the world. But the cool thing with birds when they reach adulthood is they actually gain the ability to fly as their wings are fully developed and their feathers are all complete on their wings and they actually have the ability to fly. Now there are some birds in the world who are flightless. The penguin would be an example of that, but they use their wings for swimming, not for flying. So they gain the ability to swim much better once their feathers fully develop. So those are our birds, but let's get into the meat of today's topic. Let's get into the reptiles and the amphibians. So the amphibian life cycle. The amphibian life cycle is a little bit different, even though it still follows this basic pattern of birth, growth, reproduction, and death. It does have different stages. Like the insects were different. The amphibians are going to be different. So amphibians actually gain a 4th stage. So they're going to start with birth. And amphibians are unique. And the main trait that defines an amphibian is that they rely on water for their life cycle. How do they rely on water? Do y'all know? Think about that for a minute. So they have to actually lay their eggs in water. If their eggs are laid far up on land, they have the risk of being taken by a predator. And they're also really, really tiny. And they just have a real small gel layer that protects the eggs. So if they're away from the water, that gel might dry up. And unfortunately, those babies may not survive. So our amphibians are going to have their eggs in or right next to a body of water. They're going to spend their early life dependent on that water. So they're going to be swimming around. How many of y'all have ever seen a tadpole? Y'all seen tadpoles swimming around in the water? So tadpoles would be the adolescent stage for our amphibians. So tadpoles are really cool in the fact that they actually don't breathe with lungs. Their lungs haven't developed yet. So they're actually going to be breathing with gills. Just like you see fish. When you look at a fish, you see those flaps of skin and scales on their neck that are kind of oscillating like this, moving up and down. So those are their gills, allowing them to actually run water over their gills and absorb oxygen out of the water to breathe. So tadpoles are going to lose that ability to breathe with gills as they develop. But first, before they lose their gills, they're going to begin to grow their legs. So they're going to start with their hind legs. So between 6 and 9 weeks after they hatch, the baby tadpoles are going to start to grow 2 hind legs. And then right about the time or just after their legs have developed, they're going to start to grow their lungs. So when that happens, they won't be able to stay far under the water. They're actually going to have to come to the surface. Like when we're swimming, we have to come up and breathe when we come out of the water. The tadpoles now have to do the same thing. So at this stage, we would actually refer to them as a froglet. So froglets are actually going to breathe with lungs just like us. So they'll be hanging out on the surface of the water. And at this point, they're really going to look like a small frog with a tiny tail on its back end. And they're actually going to use that tail as their energy source. That's their food source until they can actually come out of the water when they reach adulthood. And that's when they'll actually begin to feed on insects. So once the frog is on land, it's actually going to change its diet from small microscopic things and small animals in the water to insects on land, which is why we love having amphibians around, because they rid us of some of the insects like mosquitoes, flies, that give us a lot of trouble. So that is the amphibian life cycle, and this is the one that we're really focusing on here because it is so unique. Because these animals go through a metamorphosis, just like our insects do. They just have a slightly different way that they do it. Instead of going into a chrysalis to actually develop, they're actually going to just be growing their different body parts that they'll need to survive on land. So what I need y'all to do right now is in your kit, there was a bag labeled Lesson 3. So I need y'all to get that bag out, and inside of it, you're going to find a piece of paper that looks kind of like a landscape with land and water, as well as a sticker sheet with a bunch of different tadpoles, eggs, frogs, froglets, labels, and some insects. So what y'all are going to do after you've removed those from your Lesson 3 bag, y'all are going to create your own scene to demonstrate the life cycle of a frog. So I want y'all to be really creative here and come up with your own vision as to how these guys would develop, because they're actually going to be in the water at the same time. So you don't necessarily in a body of water just have a whole bunch of tadpoles, then a whole bunch of froglets, and then frogs. You're going to have different aged frogs all around that pond. So you're going to have a mix of tadpoles, some froglets, and some adults that are going to be outside the water. So I want y'all to use your imagination, your creativity. Go ahead and pause the video for a few minutes. And I want y'all to really work on this and create a really cute scene just like the one that I have demonstrated here on the slide. So go ahead, pause the video, do your creative thinking, come up with a design that really shows how frogs develop from their eggs all the way through an adult frog. All right, so hopefully y'all came up with some really cool designs for your frog life cycle. If you want to, you can feel free to draw some arrows on there to show which stage the frog is moving through as it moves across the page. But I want to look at one group that we link in with the amphibians quite often. Most time you'll hear people talk about reptiles, and they'll actually be talking about frogs, salamanders, and lizards. But they don't actually all go in the same group. And you might be thinking, Kevin, that doesn't make any sense. They all have kind of scaly, slippery skin. They all look the same, but there are some major differences. And I want y'all to see if you can think, what is the main difference between a reptile and an amphibian? The major difference is, if you look at the picture here of my friend the alligator, you'll see that there is no water involved. They may live in the water, but they do not depend on the water for their survival. Yes, they'll start out as eggs, but then when alligators are in their adolescent stage, they're going to be in the juvenile stage, very similar to the way mammals go through their life. These immature alligators just look like miniature versions of the adults. They may have slightly different coloring, but their colors will change as they develop into adulthood. So when reptiles are born, their eggs are going to actually be laid up on land. And unlike frogs, whereas a mama frog will actually lay her eggs and then abandon the eggs, reptiles, a lot of them will actually care for and defend their eggs. While there are some examples, like the sea turtle, who come up on land and lay their eggs and then return to the ocean, there are other animals such as the alligator that actually defend their nests until their babies are born, and then they will actually care for those babies and kind of help them defend them from predators, make sure that they learn how to hunt, they learn how to survive on their own, even though they have the ability to. Just like when we were little, we still depended on our parents to do quite a bit in our lives. But as we grow older, we get more independent and are able to do things on our own. Same for reptiles. So as I said, juveniles will look similar to the adults. They may have different coloring. And you may be asking yourself, Kevin, how long does it take for reptiles to go from the juvenile stage to the adult stage? And the same with mammals, birds, amphibians. The answer really is, and this is an answer y'all are going to see quite often in the wildlife and natural resource world, is it depends. It depends on the animal species. It depends on the environment that they live in. In other words, how much food is available. Are the temperatures good for the animal to grow? Is it really cold? Is it really hot? All of these things are going to play into how long it takes that animal to actually develop. So once reptiles reach adulthood, again, just like our previous animals, reproduction is the primary goal. So depending on the species, those adults, like I said, are going to protect their eggs, or some might abandon them. Along those lines, also lifespans vary between animals. So some may live for a very short amount of time. Some may live for a very long time. For example, the Galapagos tortoise actually can live up to, the oldest one on record was 170 years old. That's pretty old. So it really depends. Some have very short lifespans. Some have very long lifespans. So we're going to see how much y'all learned. So let's do a quick recap here before we wrap up. So we looked at some more life cycles, and this is really wrapping up our first block of our Nature Club presentations. We wanted to show y'all the different life cycles of animals, so y'all got to see all of these animals that I showed y'all, the mammals, the birds, the reptiles, the amphibians. And then with Molly, she showed y'all the insect life cycles, as well as the life cycles of plants. So now that we've looked at all of the life cycles of our different organisms, what we're going to do is we're going to talk more about what happens as these animals grow up and how do they survive in the wild. So in our next lesson, to give y'all a preview of what we're going to talk about, we're going to be looking at food webs. So how do animals depend on each other for food? So I thank y'all for joining me today. I hope y'all learned a little bit more about the animals that we share the world with and how they go from being either a tiny little juvenile animal or an egg to being a fully grown adult that we see every day possibly. So thank y'all again. I hope y'all have an awesome day or evening, and I look forward to seeing y'all in our next lesson.